The day began like any other, mundane and predictable, the kind of day that suburban engineers like me, Chris, found comfort in. I had just returned from a conference a day earlier than planned, a rare change from my rigid schedule. As I stepped into the house, the quietness struck me. Barbara, my wife of 12 years, was nowhere to be found, which wasn't unusual for a weekday afternoon. Yet, something felt off. The first thing that caught my attention was the faint scent of a perfume I didn't recognize. It lingered in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of lavender from the air freshener. My mind dismissed it as harmless. Perhaps she had friends over recently. Heading to the bedroom to unpack, I noticed the trash can beside the desk was nearly full, uncharacteristic for Barbara, who prided herself on her compulsive tidiness. I tugged out a few crumpled receipts and paused. One slip of paper stood out. It wasn't from a grocery store or a local boutique. No, it was from a hotel, a name I knew well but had no reason to be familiar with. The Golden Pines Lodge. The date printed on the receipt was 3 days ago, and the total wasn't small. My stomach churned. "What's this?" I murmured aloud, though the empty room offered no reply. At first, I tried rationalizing. Maybe it was for her book club, an outing with her friends? But why hadn't she mentioned it? The seed of doubt, once planted, began to grow. I shoved the receipt back into my pocket and sat on the bed, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the nagging thought that this was something more. Then my gaze fell on her bedside table. A book she'd been reading was there, along with her phone charger, but the usual comfort of seeing her things only intensified the weight in my chest. Barbara had always been my rock, smart, vivacious, and the life of every gathering. If there was ever a crack in our foundation, she had hidden it well. I thought of our life together, our shared dreams, the nights we stayed up talking about our future, and even the arguments that had made us stronger. The idea that something could be wrong was unbearable. I decided not to confront her just yet. Instead, I spent the next hour meticulously going through her closet and drawers, not to find something incriminating, but to find nothing at all that could explain the receipt. My hope crumbled with every drawer I shut. It was then that I found the second clue, a simple thing really. Her jewelry box, which normally sat untouched except for special occasions, had shifted slightly. When I opened it, a necklace I'd never seen before sparkled under the bedroom light. My heart sank. It wasn't something I'd given her. I clenched my fist around the receipt in my pocket. Could I be overreacting? Could all this mean nothing? But deep down, I knew it wasn't nothing. Barbara returned home later that evening, carrying groceries and wearing her usual bright smile. But when she kissed me on the cheek, I noticed it lacked the warmth it once held. And for the first time in years, I didn't ask her how her day had been. I couldn't. Instead, I stood in the kitchen, watching her laugh as she chopped vegetables. It was surreal. This woman, my wife, was still the same Barbara I had fallen in love with. Or was she? The receipt burned in my pocket like a brand, and I had a sinking feeling this was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up before Barbara, lying there in the stillness of our bedroom, staring at the ceiling fan slowly spinning above me. I could hear her gentle breathing beside me, so familiar, yet now so alien. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of that receipt flashed before me, accompanied by the glint of that unfamiliar necklace. Barbara stirred, and I pretended to sleep. She leaned over and kissed my forehead softly before getting out of bed. I couldn't remember the last time her affection felt so hollow, so calculated. I needed clarity, answers, proof. As soon as she left for her morning run, I sprang into action. I rifled through her side of the closet, checking the usual hiding spots. The necklace, untouched since I saw it the previous day, mocked me with its pristine shine. There were no other receipts, no letters, no clues. My next move felt wrong, but I didn't care. I grabbed her laptop, flipped it open, and entered the password she'd always used. It didn't work. I tried again, slower this time. Still nothing. A creeping unease crawled up my spine. Barbara had changed her password. The old Barbara, my Barbara, would have told me if she had done this. We didn't keep secrets. That was our thing. But now, the barrier she had put up felt like a wall I didn't know how to climb. As I closed the laptop, I noticed her phone charging on the kitchen counter. Barbara was still out jogging. My heart pounded as I picked it up. I'd never gone through her phone before. I never needed to. But now, my hands trembled as I swiped up to unlock it. Password protected. My mind raced. She'd used my birthday for years. I tried it and was denied. Then our anniversary. Nothing. Panic set in. She had changed this too. Every discovery tightened the knot in my stomach. This wasn't the behavior of someone with nothing to hide. Just then I heard the faint click of the front door opening. I quickly set the phone back on the counter and grabbed a coffee mug to appear nonchalant. Barbara walked into the kitchen, her face glowing from her run. "Morning," she said, smiling as she kissed me on the cheek. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. "Long day ahead." "Don't forget about dinner with Jenny and Paul tonight," she added, her tone light. "They've been dying to catch up." I nodded, though the thought of sitting across from two people pretending to be our friends made my blood boil. They were her friends more than mine. How much did they know? Did they see the cracks before I did? As Barbara hummed to herself and made her smoothie, I grabbed my car keys and kissed her on the top of her head. "Heading out early," I said. "Be safe," she replied without looking up. I stepped outside, inhaling deeply. The cool morning air did little to calm the storm brewing inside me. I needed a plan, and I needed it fast. That afternoon, I called Mike, a coworker who had dabbled in private investigations as a side hustle. I explained my situation as carefully as I could, keeping my voice calm even though my insides churned. "Chris, man, this doesn't sound good," Mike said after a long pause. "But listen, if you're going to go down this road, you have to be sure. You need proof. Real proof." "I know," I muttered. "What do you suggest?" "Start small. Check her habits. If she's up to something, she'll slip. They always do." I thanked Mike and hung up, feeling a strange mix of guilt and determination. If Barbara was hiding something, I would find it. And if she wasn't, I needed to clear these doubts from my mind before they consumed me. That evening, as we sat across from Jenny and Paul at the Italian restaurant, I played the part of the devoted husband. Barbara laughed, joked, and leaned against me affectionately, her hand resting on my arm. But I saw it now, the small, practiced movements, the way she avoided eye contact when I brought up her recent work trip. I noticed Jenny glance at Barbara more than once, her expression unreadable but not entirely innocent. Paul, on the other hand, was his usual boisterous self, keeping the conversation lively. Was he oblivious? Or was he in on it too? By the time we left the restaurant, I was more convinced than ever that the life I thought we had was a carefully constructed lie. The real Barbara was slipping through my fingers, and I didn't know how to catch her, or if I even wanted to anymore. The next morning, I began piecing together what I knew, or rather, what I suspected. The receipt, the changed passwords, the necklace, and then there was her behavior. Subtle shifts, guarded smiles, the way her laughter had begun to feel rehearsed. All of it pointed to one conclusion. But if I wanted answers, I needed more than hunches. That afternoon, while Barbara was at work, I decided to dig deeper. Her laptop had been a dead end, but there were other places she couldn't hide from me. Our shared phone plan allowed me access to call logs. It was something I'd never thought to use before. Why would I? I had trusted her completely. Logging into the account, I scanned through her call history. Most were to familiar numbers, friends, family, work contacts. But one number popped up repeatedly, almost daily for the past 10 months. It wasn't saved under a name, just a generic string of digits. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number, my heart pounding with every ring. After 4 rings, the line clicked, and a man's voice answered. "Hello." I froze. My throat tightened. I had no idea what to say, so I hung up immediately, my hand shaking as I placed the phone back on the desk. My mind raced. Who was he? A coworker? A friend? Or was it worse? Was he the reason behind the hotel receipt? I stared at the phone, tempted to call again, but the fear of confrontation stopped me. Instead, I copied the number and pasted it into a reverse lookup tool online. The results came back with a name that chilled me to my core. Eric Weston. Eric was a name I recognized immediately. He was a contractor who had done some landscaping work for us last year. He had seemed friendly, overly so, but I'd chalked it up to his personality. Barbara had been the one to hire him. She had insisted on handling the project herself, claiming she wanted to surprise me with a new patio. I had thought nothing of it at the time, but now I wondered if the patio had been a cover for something else. That evening, I sat across from Barbara at dinner, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. She was cheerful, as always, but I could tell she noticed my silence. "You okay?" she asked, tilting her head with feigned concern. "Just tired," I replied, forcing a smile. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment before she returned to her meal. It was a dance we had started performing in recent weeks, her pretending everything was fine, me pretending I didn't notice the cracks. After dinner, while Barbara was upstairs taking a shower, I decided to test a theory. I picked up her phone from the counter. It was locked, of course, but I had an idea. Barbara had always been sentimental. If her passwords had changed, maybe the new one was something equally predictable. I entered our anniversary date. The screen unlocked. My breath hitched as I scrolled through her messages, my hands trembling. At first, there was nothing unusual. Texts from friends, group chats, work updates. But then I saw it. A string of messages from Eric Weston. The text started innocently enough. Discussions about the patio project. Questions about schedules and materials. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. The messages became more personal, more intimate. "Eric, miss seeing you today. Wish we had more time. Barbara, me too. Last night was amazing. Can't wait for the next time." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The air around me seemed heavier, suffocating. I kept scrolling, each message another dagger to the heart. "Eric, you're the best part of my day, Barb. He doesn't deserve you. Barbara, stop. He's a good man. This is just complicated. Complicated." The word burned into my brain like a brand. I had been a fool, blind to what had been happening right under my nose. This wasn't just a fling. It was emotional, personal, a betrayal that cut deeper than I could have imagined. I put the phone down, my hands clammy and my chest tight. For a moment, I thought about confronting her right then and there. But I stopped myself. I needed more. Not for my sake, but for the sake of the truth. I needed her to admit it, to own up to what she had done. That night, as I lay beside her in bed, the weight of her betrayal pressed down on me. Barbara, the woman I had loved for over a decade, was a stranger now. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word of affection over the past 10 months felt like a lie. My mind was a storm of anger, sadness, and something darker, a need for justice. As she drifted off to sleep, I stared at the ceiling, my mind already beginning to formulate a plan. I didn't just want to expose her betrayal. I wanted everyone involved. Eric, our so-called friends, even my brother, who I suspected knew about the affair, to feel the consequences of their complicity. Barbara had made her choice. Now, it was time for me to make mine. The next day, I woke up with clarity, a rare feeling amidst the turmoil of the past few days. Barbara's betrayal wasn't just about her and Eric. It was about everyone who had enabled it, the friends who had looked me in the eye while keeping her secret, and, worst of all, my own brother. These weren't just accidents of circumstance. They were deliberate choices to deceive me. That knowledge burned hotter than my anger at Barbara herself. I needed to act, but not rashly. Confrontation was tempting, but it wouldn't give me what I wanted: answers, accountability, and consequences. I needed something more calculated, more definitive. That afternoon, while Barbara was at work, I began setting the stage. My first move was gathering evidence. The text messages on her phone were a start, but I needed more. I ordered a set of discrete cameras and audio recorders online, choosing expedited shipping to get them as soon as possible. In the meantime, I began digging into her life outside of the house. I remembered she had recently started keeping a second phone charger in her purse. At the time, I'd thought nothing of it, but now I saw it as a potential clue. If she had a second phone, it was likely the key to her communications with Eric. I needed to find it. When Barbara came home that evening, I greeted her as usual, masking my growing contempt behind a smile. Dinner was a quiet affair, filled with small talk and forced laughter. As she cleaned up, I watched her carefully. Every movement, every glance, every word felt like a clue waiting to be deciphered. Later that night, while she showered, I checked her purse. Nothing. No second phone. But then I remembered the necklace. That new, unfamiliar piece of jewelry had been tucked away in her drawer. Could it be a gift from Eric? Could it hold some hidden significance? I resolved to investigate further. The cameras and recording devices arrived the next day. I spent the afternoon installing them in key locations around the house. Our bedroom, the kitchen, and the living room. I placed one in the car as well, hidden beneath the dashboard. These devices would capture not only her movements, but also her conversations. I needed to know the truth, no matter how painful. Next, I reached out to a private investigator recommended by Mike. His name was Arthur, a no-nonsense man who had spent years uncovering the hidden lives of cheaters. I explained the situation to him, leaving out the parts about my brother and friends. I wasn't ready to drag them into this yet. Not until I was certain of their involvement. "I'll start with the basics," Arthur said. "I'll tail her, see where she goes, who she meets. If she's hiding something, we'll find it." I thanked him and hung up, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. This wasn't the life I had imagined for myself. Secret cameras, private investigators, a marriage built on lies. But here I was, staring down the reality I couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, I began noticing patterns in Barbara's behavior. She was more distant, more distracted, but also oddly affectionate at times, as if trying to compensate for something. It was a dance of guilt and denial, and I played along, pretending not to notice. The cameras began to bear fruit. One evening, while I was working late at the office, I checked the live feed from our bedroom. Barbara sat on the edge of the bed, her phone in hand. She was texting someone, her face lit by the glow of the screen. She smiled, a soft, secretive smile I hadn't seen in months. My chest tightened as I watched her type, pause, and then type again. I recorded the footage, a knot forming in my stomach. The next day, I reviewed the audio recordings from her car. Most were mundane, calls to friends, music playing in the background, but then I found one that made my blood run cold. It was her voice, soft and intimate, speaking to someone I couldn't yet identify. "I miss you too," she said, her tone dripping with affection. "It's been so hard keeping this a secret, but it's worth it, isn't it?" There was a pause, followed by a man's voice, distorted but unmistakable. "Of course it is, Barb. You're everything to me." I slammed my fist onto the desk, the rage bubbling over for a moment before I forced it back down. I copied the audio file to my computer, saving it alongside the other pieces of evidence I had collected. By the end of the week, Arthur called with his findings. "Chris, she's meeting him at a hotel downtown," he said. "The same place as the receipt you found. I've got photos and timestamps if you need them. Send everything." I replied, my voice cold and steady. When the photos arrived in my inbox, I felt a strange sense of detachment as I clicked through them. There she was, holding Eric's hand, laughing with him, leaning into him in ways she hadn't leaned into me in months. It was surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold. That night, as Barbara slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I had all the proof I needed, but exposing her wasn't enough. I wanted everyone involved, Eric, our friends, my brother, to feel the weight of their betrayal. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about retribution. I wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. The next morning, I woke up with a sharper focus than I'd had in weeks. The pieces were all coming together, and the picture they painted was uglier than I could have imagined. This wasn't just about Barbara and Eric. It was about everyone who had watched me stumble through the dark while they quietly cheered her on, or at the very least, turned a blind eye. But I wasn't stumbling anymore. I sat at my desk with a cup of coffee, reviewing the evidence I'd collected. The photos from Arthur, the video clips from the cameras, the audio recordings, the texts. It was a damning compilation, and it filled me with a grim satisfaction to see it all laid out. Barbara had betrayed me, yes, but she hadn't done it alone. Now, I needed to map out who knew what and how deeply they were involved. The dinner with Jenny and Paul came to mind. The way Jenny had glanced at Barbara that night wasn't just a coincidence. There had been a silent exchange, something I had missed in the moment, but could now see with perfect clarity. And then there was my brother Mark, my own blood, who had been unusually distant lately, avoiding our usual weekend beers and brushing off my calls with flimsy excuses. I wasn't sure how far this conspiracy extended, but I intended to find out. If they had aligned themselves with Barbara, I would ensure they all felt the consequences. Later that day, I called Arthur. "I need you to expand the scope," I said. "I want to know if anyone else is connected to this. Friends, family, anyone who might have helped them cover their tracks." "That'll take time," he replied. "And it won't be cheap. I don't care about the cost. Just find out." After hanging up, I spent the afternoon revisiting old conversations, text threads, and social media posts. It was a slow, painstaking process, but patterns began to emerge. Jenny had commented on a photo Barbara had posted months ago, a picture of her and Eric at some work event. The caption had been innocuous, but Jenny's comment, "You two look great together," suddenly took on a more sinister tone. There were other hints, too. Subtle changes in how people interacted with me, the small but telling ways they deflected when I talked about Barbara. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for me to connect the dots. That evening, Barbara came home late, claiming she had stayed late at work to help with a project. I played along, nodding and pretending to listen as she spun her tale. Inside, I seethed, knowing exactly where she had been and who she had been with. As she went upstairs to shower, I checked her phone again. She hadn't cleared her messages this time. There was a text from Eric, time-stamped just 30 minutes earlier. "Can't wait to see you again." Tonight was perfect. I clenched my fists, my vision blurring for a moment as anger coursed through me. But I forced myself to calm down. I couldn't afford to lose control. Not yet. Over the next few days, Arthur's investigation began to bear fruit. He discovered that Jenny had been covering for Barbara during her work trips, even picking up the twins from school once when Barbara was supposedly out of town. Paul had known as well, though he seemed less involved, more a passive participant than an active conspirator. But the biggest blow came when Arthur confirmed my worst suspicion. Mark, my brother, had been meeting Eric. I confronted Arthur about this. "Are you sure? Maybe they just crossed paths." Arthur's voice was steady. "Chris, they've met 3 times in the last 2 months. Once at a bar, twice at Eric's house. I have photos." He sent the images to my email, and I stared at them in disbelief. There was Mark sitting across from Eric at a bar, laughing, clinking glasses. In another photo, they stood on Eric's porch, deep in conversation. My stomach churned as I realized the depth of their betrayal. My own brother, the man I had trusted more than anyone. By the weekend, I had all the pieces I needed. Barbara's betrayal had been devastating, but it was the collusion of those around me that cut the deepest. They had seen me as a fool, someone to be manipulated and pitted. That's what stung the most, their quiet, complicit mockery. But I wasn't a fool. Not anymore. I spent the weekend refining my plan. It wasn't enough to confront them. I needed to expose them, to strip away the lies they had wrapped themselves in and force them to face the truth. It had to be public, undeniable, and devastating. Barbara, Eric, Jenny, Paul, Mark, they had all played their roles in this farce. Now, I would take the stage and rewrite the ending. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, about making them feel the weight of what they had done. By Sunday night, I was ready. My trap was set. All I needed now was for them to walk into it. Monday morning arrived with a cruel clarity. The storm of emotions that had clouded my mind was gone, replaced by a cold, calculated resolve. This wasn't just about Barbara anymore. It was about everyone who had betrayed me, everyone who thought they could hide in the shadows while I stumbled blindly through the wreckage of my marriage. It was time to bring everything into the light. That morning, I made a few calls. First, to Jenny and Paul. I invited them to dinner at my house later in the week, under the pretense of needing advice on something personal. Jenny's voice was filled with false cheer, and I could practically hear the smugness in her tone as she accepted. Next, I called Mark. "Hey, Chris," he answered, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Mark," I said, forcing a smile into my voice. "I've been thinking, we haven't had a good brotherly hangout in a while. How about we grab some beers on Friday?" There was a long pause. Yeah, sure. That sounds good." "Great. My place, 7 o'clock. As I hung up, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of bitterness. He probably thought I was clueless, that this was some desperate attempt to reconnect. Good. Let him think that. The final call was to Barbara's boss. Using a bit of pretext, I confirmed that she would be attending a work dinner that night. A dinner I knew was a cover for her meeting Eric. It was all falling into place. That evening, as Barbara dressed for her work dinner, I watched her carefully. She chose a sleek black dress, one that clung to her in all the right ways. Her makeup was flawless, her perfume intoxicating. She looked incredible, like the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. And yet, as she stood there in front of the mirror, adjusting her necklace, the one Eric had no doubt given her, all I could see was the betrayal. She turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Don't wait up, okay?" she said, kissing me lightly on the cheek. "Of course not," I replied, my voice steady. "Have fun." She left without a second glance, and I immediately went to my computer. The cameras I had installed in the car and around the house streamed directly to my laptop. As Barbara drove to her rendezvous, I watched in real time, my heart pounding in my chest. When she arrived at the hotel, Eric was waiting for her outside. He greeted her with a kiss that lingered far too long. They walked inside together, hand in hand, oblivious to the camera I had placed in her car, which captured every second. The next few days were a blur of preparation. I compiled all the evidence, the photos, the videos, the audio recordings, into a single, devastating presentation. It wasn't just for me. It was for them, for everyone who had played a part in this deception. I also began crafting my plan for the dinner. Jenny, Paul, and Mark would all be there. Barbara, of course, would have no idea what was coming. The goal wasn't just to confront them, but to expose them, to strip away their lies, and force them to face the truth in front of each other. By the time Friday arrived, I was ready. That evening, as the guests began to arrive, I greeted them with a warmth that felt alien but necessary. Jenny and Paul were first, bringing a bottle of wine and their usual faux friendliness. Mark showed up shortly after, looking slightly uneasy, but covering it with forced laughter. Barbara, of course, played the perfect hostess, smiling and chatting as if nothing was amiss. Watching her interact with them made my stomach churn, but I kept my composure. I had to. Once we were all seated at the dining table, I poured everyone a glass of wine and raised mine in a toast. To good friends and family, I said, my voice calm and measured, and to the truth. They all clinked their glasses, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. As dinner progressed, I steered the conversation toward relationships and trust, dropping subtle hints that made Barbara shift uncomfortably in her seat. Jenny shot her a questioning glance, but Barbara avoided her gaze. Mark, meanwhile, focused on his plate, barely contributing to the conversation. When the meal was finished, I stood up and cleared my throat. "There's something I want to share with all of you," I said, pulling out a small remote. "I've been working on this for a while now. I think it'll help clear up some things." I pressed the button, and the TV on the wall flickered to life. The first image appeared, a photo of Barbara and Eric entering the hotel together. The room went silent. "What the hell is this?" Barbara asked, her voice trembling. I ignored her and clicked to the next slide. A video played, showing her and Eric kissing in the car. Then another, of them walking into the hotel lobby, holding hands. Jenny's face went pale. Paul looked away. Mark froze, his expression a mixture of guilt and shock. "Let's not pretend we don't know what's happening here," I said, my voice sharp. "Barbara, you've been seeing Eric for 10 months. Jenny, you've been covering for her. And Mark?" I turned to my brother, my voice dripping with contempt. "You've been meeting with Eric behind my back. What were you discussing, exactly? How to keep this secret from me?" Mark stammered, but no words came out. Barbara stood up, her face red with anger. "Chris, this is insane. How dare you spy on me? How dare I?" I snapped, my composure finally cracking. "How dare you? You lied to me. You betrayed me. And you had the audacity to think I wouldn't find out?" The silence that followed was deafening. No one dared to speak, their guilt hanging in the air like a noose. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling. This isn't just about Barbara. It's about all of you. Every single one of you knew what was happening, and not one of you thought I deserved the truth. I let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. This ends now. Barbara, I want a divorce. Mark, you're no longer my brother. And as for the rest of you, get out of my house. The room erupted into chaos, but I didn't hear a word of it. I had said what I needed to say. The truth was out, and they couldn't hide from it anymore. As they filed out one by one, I sat down at the empty table, the weight of the evening settling over me. For the first time in months, I felt free. When the door finally shut behind the last of them, the silence in the house was deafening. I sat at the dining table, staring at the empty plates and half-drunk glasses of wine, the chaos of the night still echoing in my mind. The adrenaline that had kept me steady through it all began to fade, leaving behind a strange emptiness. Barbara had been the last to leave. Her face was a mix of fury and desperation as she pleaded with me at the door, her voice trembling. "Chris, please, just let me explain," she had said, her hands clutching at the doorframe as if holding on to our life together. "Explain what?" I snapped. "That you lied to me? That you dragged our friends, my brother, into your lies? That you destroyed everything we built together for some guy who doesn't even have the decency to show his face tonight?" Her tears, genuine or not, had no effect on me. "Get out," I had said, my voice cold. "We're done." The next morning, I woke up in the guest room, the bed unmade from nights of restless sleep. The house felt hollow, the usual hum of Barbara's morning routine conspicuously absent. I couldn't decide if the emptiness was a relief or a curse. The first call came from Mark. I let it go to voicemail, but his message was exactly what I expected. Stumbling excuses, pleas for forgiveness, and a pathetic attempt to paint himself as a victim of circumstance. "Chris, I didn't know how to tell you," his voice said, shaky and strained. "I thought I was helping, keeping things calm until she could figure out what she wanted. I never meant to hurt you." I deleted the message without listening to the rest. He wasn't worth my anger anymore. Over the next few days, the fallout spread like wildfire. Word of the dinner had clearly reached our social circle. Jenny texted me twice, both messages some flavor of "I'm so sorry." I didn't know what else to do. Lies. They all knew exactly what they were doing, and now they were scrambling to justify their cowardice. Barbara, to her credit, kept her distance. She texted me once, asking when she could come by to pick up her things. I told her to schedule it through her lawyer. If she was going to treat our marriage like a business deal, I would do the same. The silence gave me time to reflect, to feel the full weight of what had happened. Anger came in waves, but it was the sadness that lingered. I wasn't just mourning my marriage. I was mourning the person I thought Barbara was, the life I thought we had, and the trust one thought I could place in the people closest to me. By the end of the week, I had begun the process of dismantling what remained of our shared life. I called a lawyer to start the divorce proceedings, changing the locks on the house the same day. I wasn't going to let Barbara waltz back in whenever she pleased. This was my home now. I also sent a message to Mark, short and to the point. "Don't contact me again. You're no longer my brother." It was harsh, but it needed to be said. He had made his choice the moment he sided with Barbara and Eric. Family didn't mean anything if it wasn't built on trust. The only person I kept in my life was Arthur, the private investigator. He checked in on me a few times, offering words of support that felt more genuine than anything I'd heard from my so-called friends. "You're doing the right thing," he said during one of our calls. "It hurts now, but you'll come out stronger for it." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. One night, about 2 weeks after the dinner, I received a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Chris," a familiar voice said. It was Eric. I nearly hung up but stopped myself. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice colder than I thought possible. I wanted to apologize," he said, "for everything. Barbara told me she was unhappy, and I thought—" "You thought what?" I interrupted, my anger rising. "That you could step into someone else's marriage and fix it? That you were entitled to something that wasn't yours? You're a coward, Eric. You, and everyone who helped you." He was silent for a moment, then said, "You're right. I just wanted to tell you I'm sorry. Don't call me again. I said before hanging up. I stared at the phone for a long time after that. His apology didn't mean anything to me. Nothing any of them said or did could undo the damage they had caused. By the end of the month, the house felt less like a battlefield and more like a sanctuary. Barbara's things were gone, her presence reduced to faint memories in the corners of the rooms. I began to reclaim the space, rearranging furniture, painting walls, making it my own. The betrayal had broken me in ways I couldn't yet fully understand, but it had also given me a clarity I hadn't had before. The people who had failed me were no longer a part of my life, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. In the weeks that followed, the house felt like an echo chamber, but one that no longer mocked me with hidden truths. The silence was mine to command now, a blank slate to rebuild my life upon. I didn't miss the familiar routines that Barbara and I had shared. Those routines had become lies long before I realized it. What I missed, however, was the version of myself that believed in those routines, in the love I thought we had. That man was gone, and in his place stood someone who wasn't quite sure what came next. The divorce process started moving quickly, thanks to the mountain of evidence I had compiled. Barbara's lawyer reached out, and our interactions were predictably cold. She didn't fight me on much. The house stayed with me. She kept her car and a few pieces of furniture. She didn't even argue for alimony, though I suspected that it had less to do with fairness and more to do with her guilt. The one sticking point was Eric. Barbara's lawyer tried to weave him into the narrative as an innocent bystander, someone who offered support during a challenging time. I laughed when I read that line in one of the emails. The nerve, the audacity. I sent back a counteroffer through my lawyer. If they kept pushing that angle, I'd make the evidence public, not just to Eric's wife. Yes, he was married, another discovery thanks to Arthur, but to their entire social circles. The emails went quiet after that. One evening, as I was sorting through old photos, deciding what to keep and what to throw away, I came across a picture of Barbara and me on our 10th wedding anniversary. We were sitting at a small table by the beach, her hand resting on mine. I remembered that night vividly. The way she'd laughed at some silly joke I'd made, the way her eyes sparkled under the moonlight. For a moment, I let myself feel the weight of the loss. Not of Barbara, but of the life we'd built. I had given her everything I had, every part of myself, and it still hadn't been enough. The pain was sharp, but it was also fleeting. I placed the photo in a box marked trash and closed the lid. Mark, of course, ignored my message about cutting ties. He called a few times, leaving voicemails filled with apologies and explanations that I didn't bother listening to. His betrayal was perhaps the hardest to accept, not just because he was my brother, but because he had been one of the few people I thought would always have my back. I sent him one final text. There's nothing left to say. Goodbye. He didn't call again after that. The strangest part of the fallout was how quickly the world around me adjusted. The friends who had once been so intertwined in our lives quietly distanced themselves, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of shame. Jenny and Paul sent one final text apologizing for everything before disappearing from my life entirely. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. They weren't worth my time. Even Barbara faded into the background, her presence reduced to occasional emails from her lawyer. The woman who had once been my partner, my confidant, my everything, was now just a name at the bottom of a legal document. By the second month, the house started to feel like my own. I rearranged the furniture, painted the walls, and even turned the guest room into a small office where I could work on projects. I started running again, something I hadn't done in years. The physical exhaustion was a welcome relief from the emotional weight I carried. Arthur checked in on me occasionally, his no-nonsense demeanor a strange comfort. "You doing okay?" he asked one day. "Better than I thought I would be," I admitted. "You're tougher than most," he said. "You took control of the situation. A lot of people just let it destroy them." "Sometimes it feels like it has," I said, my voice quieter. Arthur shrugged. "You're still here. That's all that matters." One day, I came across an old notebook in the back of a drawer. It was filled with sketches and notes from a woodworking project I had started years ago, but never finished. I pulled it out and spent the afternoon in the garage, dusting off tools and salvaging scraps of wood. The rhythm of the work, the smell of sawdust, the hum of the power tools, it was grounding in a way I hadn't expected. Over the weeks, I threw myself into the project, transforming the wood into a small but beautiful bench. It wasn't perfect. There were uneven edges, rough patches I couldn't quite sand down, but it was mine. When I finished, I placed it in the backyard, overlooking the garden Barbara had once tended so carefully. By the third month, the legal process was nearly complete. Barbara and I met one last time at the courthouse to finalize the divorce. She looked different, smaller somehow, deflated. She didn't meet my eyes as we signed the papers. When it was over, she turned to leave, but paused. "Chris," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry." I looked at her for a long moment, searching for something. Remorse, sincerity, closure. Maybe it was there, maybe it wasn't. I nodded, offering her the only thing I had left to give. "Goodbye, Barbara." She left without another word, and I walked out into the sunlight, free for the first time in months. That night, I sat on the bench in the backyard, staring up at the stars. The pain was still there, but it felt lighter, less suffocating. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like it was mine to shape. The betrayal had broken me, but it hadn't destroyed me. And as I sat there, the cool night air wrapping around me, I realized I wasn't just rebuilding a house, a life, or even myself. I was building something stronger. The days that followed felt lighter, though not without their echoes of pain. The house was quieter now, not just because Barbara was gone, but because the weight of her lies no longer filled the air. It was a strange kind of silence, part freedom, part loneliness. I dove headfirst into rebuilding my life. Not just the physical space around me, but the emotional framework that had been shattered. The mornings became mine again. Coffee on the back porch, watching the sunrise as I sat on the bench I'd built. Each day felt like reclaiming a little more of myself. One morning, as I was clearing out the garage, I found an old box of keepsakes Barbara and I had stored years ago. Inside were photos, letters, and mementos from the life we'd built together. I sat there for a long time, staring at the evidence of what once was. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. Instead, I sifted through the memories with a strange detachment, like flipping through a stranger's scrapbook. Some pieces I kept, a photo of us from our first Christmas, a postcard from our honeymoon. The rest I tossed into a trash bag, leaving the past where it belonged. As the weeks turned into months, I began reaching out to people I hadn't spoken to in years. Old friends, colleagues, even distant relatives. I wasn't looking for sympathy or validation, just connection. I needed to rebuild my circle, to surround myself with people who valued honesty and loyalty. One of those calls was to my friend Mike, the one who had helped me piece together Barbara's betrayal in the first place. "Chris," he said when I told him about the divorce, "I'm sorry it came to this. But honestly, I think you're better off without her." "I know," I said. "It just took me a while to see it." "Come visit," he offered. "I'll buy you a beer, and we'll talk about something other than this mess." For the first time in what felt like forever, I laughed. "I'll hold you to that." The garden, once Barbara's domain, had become my new project. At first, I considered tearing it all out, wiping away every trace of her. But something stopped me. Instead, I decided to make it my own. I replaced the wilted flowers with new ones, laid fresh mulch, and even built a small pond with a fountain. It was hard work, but it gave me a sense of purpose, a reason to get my hands dirty and create something beautiful out of the wreckage. One day, as I was finishing up in the garden, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Mark. I hadn't heard from him since my final text, and I almost ignored it. But curiosity got the better of me. "Chris, I know you don't want to hear from me, but I need to say this. I messed up. I should have told you the truth. But I was scared of losing you as my brother. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope you'll consider it someday. You're my family, and I miss you." I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to delete it, to bury him in the same grave as Barbara and the others. But another part of me, the part that still believed in second chances, hesitated. I didn't respond. Not yet. But I didn't delete it either. The next major step came unexpectedly. While picking up supplies for the garden at a local hardware store, I ran into an old college friend, Sarah. We had dated briefly before life took us in different directions, and though we had stayed friendly on social media, we hadn't seen each other in years. "Chris," she said, her face lighting up as she recognized me. "Wow, it's been forever." "It has," I said, surprised at how genuine my smile felt. "What are you doing here?" "Picking up some paint. I'm finally redecorating my living room," she said, laughing. "What about you?" "Gardening," I replied, motioning to the cart full of mulch and plants. "Trying to make something decent out of my backyard." We chatted for a while, catching up on life and laughing about old memories. Before she left, she gave me her number. "If you ever need advice on plants or redecorating, give me a call. I might take you up on that," I said, pocketing the slip of paper. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Hope. That evening, as I sat on my bench, the stars beginning to appear overhead, I thought about Sarah's smile, about the way she had laughed at my lame jokes. I didn't know if it meant anything, or if I was ready for it to mean anything. But it was a reminder that there was still good in the world, still people worth trusting. By the end of the month, I had built a life that felt solid again. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was mine. The scars from Barbara's betrayal were still there, and they always would be. But they no longer defined me. They were just part of the story, a chapter in a book that was still being written. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see what the next chapter would hold. The days began to blend together in a way that felt comforting, not numbing. I had routines now, not the routines Barbara and I had shared, but new ones that were mine alone. Morning coffee on the bench in the garden, long walks in the evenings, and late nights tinkering with woodworking projects in the garage. Each day felt like a small victory, a step further away from the betrayal that had consumed my life. One afternoon, I decided to take Sarah up on her offer. It had been a couple of weeks since we'd run into each other, and I had hesitated at first, unsure if reaching out was the right thing to do. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I missed simple, honest conversations. I dialed her number, my palms sweating slightly as I waited for her to answer. "Chris." "Hi," she said, her voice warm and cheerful. "I was wondering if you'd call." "I didn't want to wait too long," I replied, smiling despite myself. "I could use some advice on my garden, and maybe a fresh perspective on, well, everything." She laughed softly. "I'm no life coach, but I'll do my best. How about coffee tomorrow? There's a little place downtown I love." "Sounds perfect," I said. When we hung up, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and nerves. It wasn't a date, at least not in the traditional sense, but it felt like a step toward something, even if I didn't know what that something was yet. The coffee shop was quiet when I arrived, a cozy corner tucked away from the bustle of downtown. Sarah was already there, a steaming cup in her hands and a book open on the table. When she saw me, she waved, her smile as genuine as I remembered. We talked for hours about everything and nothing. She told me about her work as a graphic designer, her love of hiking, and her recent attempt to adopt a dog from a local shelter. I told her about the garden, my newfound love of woodworking, and the mess that had been my life for the past year. She listened without judgment, her eyes kind and attentive. "You've been through hell, Chris," she said softly, "but you're still here. That says a lot about you." "I don't feel strong," I admitted. "Most days I feel like I'm just barely keeping it together." "That's the thing about strength," she said. "You don't always feel it. Sometimes it's just about showing up, even when it hurts." Her words stayed with me long after we said goodbye. As I drove home, I realized how much lighter I felt, how good it was to talk to someone who saw me for who I was now, not who I had been with Barbara. In the weeks that followed, Sarah and I began spending more time together. Coffee turned into lunch, which turned into hiking trips and hours spent talking about everything under the sun. It wasn't romantic, at least not yet. It was companionship, honest and uncomplicated, and it was exactly what I needed. She became a sounding board as I navigated the final stages of my divorce. "It's okay to feel angry," she told me one day as we walked through the park, "but don't let it consume you. Barbara doesn't get to control your life anymore." "I know," I said. "It's just hard to let go of the bitterness." "You'll get there," she said, her hand brushing against mine as we walked. "You're already on your way." The divorce was finalized in early spring, a quiet end to what had once felt like an all-consuming storm. Barbara and I didn't see each other that day. Everything was handled through our lawyers. When my attorney handed me the finalized papers, I felt a strange sense of relief, mingled with sadness. That night, I burned the last of the photos I'd kept of us together. Not out of anger, but as a way to close the chapter. As the flames consumed the images, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. By summer, the garden was in full bloom. The once neglected space was now a riot of color. Roses, sunflowers, and daisies standing tall under the warm sun. The bench I'd built sat under the shade of a tree, a peaceful spot where I spent many evenings watching the world go by. One evening, Sarah joined me there, a bottle of wine in hand. We sat together as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. "This is beautiful," she said, looking around the garden. "You've created something amazing here." "Thanks," I said, smiling. "It's been therapeutic." She turned to me, her eyes meeting mine. "You have a way of making things better, Chris, even when they're broken." For a moment, we sat in silence, the air between us charged with something unspoken. Then she reached out, her hand resting gently on mine. "You've been rebuilding," she said softly. "Maybe it's time to start something new." I looked at her, my heart beating faster than I'd like to admit. Maybe it is. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about her words. Starting something new. It wasn't something I'd been ready for months ago, but now it felt possible. The betrayal that had shattered my world was no longer the story of my life. It was just one chapter, and the book was far from finished. For the first time in a long time, I fell asleep with a smile on my face. The days following that evening with Sarah felt like the opening lines of a new story. The weight I had carried for so long, anger, betrayal, sadness, was still there, but it had shifted. It no longer dictated my every move, no longer consumed me. Instead, it became part of me, a scar that reminded me of where I'd been, not where I was going. Sarah and I began spending more time together, though neither of us put a label on it. We didn't need to. There was a comfort between us that didn't require explanations. Some days, we hiked the local trails, her laughter echoing through the woods as we recounted old stories. Other days, we sat in my garden, sipping coffee or wine, talking about the lives we were building. She was a steady presence, grounding me in ways I hadn't expected. And for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder if she was meant to be more than that. One evening, as we sat together on the bench I had built, Sarah turned to me, her expression serious. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said. "Do you ever think about what you'll do next? Not just with the garden or your projects, but with your life?" Her question caught me off guard. I had spent so much time focusing on rebuilding what I had lost that I hadn't allowed myself to dream about what came next. "I don't know," I admitted. "For a while, I was just trying to survive. But now, I think I'm ready to start moving forward." She smiled, her hand brushing against mine. "You deserve that, Chris. To move forward. To be happy." Her words stayed with me long after she left that night. As I sat alone in the garden, the stars twinkling overhead, I began to think about what happiness might look like. Not the happiness I had once chased with Barbara, but something new, something better. The turning point came a few weeks later. Sarah invited me to a gallery opening where one of her friends was showcasing their art. It wasn't something I would have normally attended, but her excitement was infectious, and I found myself looking forward to it. The gallery was buzzing with life when we arrived, the walls adorned with vibrant paintings and sculptures. Sarah introduced me to her friends, and I felt a strange sense of belonging among them, something I hadn't felt in years. As the night went on, we wandered through the gallery, stopping to admire the pieces that caught our attention. At one point, we found ourselves standing in front of a painting of a broken vase, its shards scattered across the canvas. But amidst the wreckage, tiny flowers grew from the cracks, their vibrant colors contrasting against the muted tones of the shattered porcelain. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, her voice soft. A reminder that even broken things can bloom. Her words struck a chord deep within me, and I turned to her, my heart racing. Sarah, she looked at me, her eyes wide and expectant. What is it? I don't know where this is going, I said, my voice trembling slightly. But I know I don't want to do it alone. You've been a light for me in ways I didn't think I'd ever find again. And I think I'd like to see where that light leads. A slow smile spread across her face, and she reached for my hand, lacing her fingers through mine. I'd like that too. From that moment, everything began to shift. Sarah and I didn't rush into anything. We didn't need to. What we were building was steady, deliberate, and honest. It was a stark contrast to the whirlwind of my past, and that made it all the more precious. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself embracing the possibilities of the future. I started taking on more projects at work, reconnecting with colleagues I had once drifted away from. I even began volunteering at a local community center, teaching woodworking to teenagers who needed a creative outlet. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was good. And for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. One evening, as Sarah and I sat in the garden, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she turned to me with a mischievous grin. You know, she said, I think it's time you taught me how to build something. I laughed, shaking my head. What do you want to build? She thought for a moment, her expression thoughtful. A table. Something we can use. Something that lasts. I smiled, my heart swelling with gratitude for this woman who had walked into my life at just the right moment. Then let's build it together. As we began sketching out designs, laughing over her less-than-perfect measurements and my tendency to overthink every detail, I realized that the table wasn't just a project. It was a metaphor for what we were creating together, a foundation, something steady and enduring. Barbara's betrayal had broken me, but it hadn't destroyed me. If anything, it had forced me to confront the cracks in my life, to rebuild stronger and wiser than before. And now, as Sarah and I worked side by side, the sawdust flying and the sound of laughter filling the air, I knew I had found something worth holding on to. A new chapter had begun, and this time, I was the one writing the story. What do you guys think of my story? Share in the comments what you think about the choice I made, and what you do in my situation.